Mara first saw the lighthouse from the deck of the supply boat just before sunset, rising from the black rocks of Eilean Moor like the spine of something dead surfacing from the Atlantic. The sea around the Flannan Isles moved strangely, not violently, but with a slow breathing motion that made her stomach uneasy. Even the boat captain refused to look directly at the island for too long. He was an old Hebridean man named Callum with cracked hands and nicotine-yellow fingernails, and during the entire trip he barely spoke except to mutter, "Nobody should stay there after dark." Mara had heard that sentence a dozen times since arriving in Scotland. The missing lighthouse keepers had become local folklore over the last century, their disappearance chewed into legend by storms and fishermen and drunken storytellers. 3 men vanished in December of 1900 without a trace. No bodies, no explanation. Doors locked. Meals untouched. Some said a rogue wave dragged them into the sea. Others believed they simply lost their minds from isolation. But Mara was not there for ghost stories. She was a documentary researcher, hired by a small production company obsessed with unsolved disappearances, and after 6 months of emails and permissions, she had finally secured rare overnight access to the island and lighthouse before a restoration project began next year. Her plan was simple: document the site, photograph old maintenance tunnels beneath the structure, and leave by morning. The weather forecast predicted clear skies, no storms, no danger. Yet as the island grew closer, she noticed something she hadn't seen in any photographs. The windows of the lighthouse looked dark from a distance, but every now and then she could swear one reflected light differently than the others, as if someone inside had shifted slightly away from the glass. "You said nobody's been here for weeks?" she asked. Callum kept his eyes on the water. "That's right. Then why is there smoke?" He went still. Mara pointed toward the cliffside behind the lighthouse, where a thin grey ribbon curled upward into the cold evening air. Not thick smoke, just enough to notice. Callum stared for several silent seconds before muttering, "Probably old Pete caught somewhere." But his voice sounded wrong, tight and shallow, and Mara noticed his hands gripping the wheel harder. By the time they reached the dock, dusk had begun leaking across the island in blue-grey shadows. The lighthouse tower stood above them, pale and towering against the darkening sky. It should have looked abandoned. Instead, it felt watchful. Mara stepped onto the slick stone pier with her backpack and camera equipment, while Callum remained on the boat. "You're not helping me carry the gear?" she asked jokingly. "I'll be back at sunrise," he replied immediately. Too quickly. "You'll stay on the boat though, right?" Callum finally looked at her fully for the first time during the journey. His eyes were bloodshot and strangely frightened. "If you hear knocking tonight," he said quietly, "don't open the lighthouse door." Then he untied her equipment without another word. Mara laughed uneasily, expecting some old island superstition to follow, but he simply pushed away from the dock and started the engine. Within moments, the boat was already retreating into the darkening ocean, leaving her alone with the sound of waves smashing against volcanic cliffs hundreds of feet below. The silence afterward felt immediate and unnatural, as if the island itself had been waiting for the engine noise to disappear. She stood there for a moment staring at the lighthouse path winding upward through sharp black grass and jagged rock. There were no birds, no insects, no wind beyond the distant sea. Just silence. Even the ocean sounded muted somehow, muffled beneath the cliffs. By the time she reached the top of the path, the sun had almost vanished completely. The lighthouse loomed overhead, taller than she imagined, its white paint stained by decades of salt and rain. The main door was already slightly open. Mara froze halfway up the final steps. She distinctly remembered reading that the caretakers had locked everything after the last inspection. Slowly, she approached. The heavy metal hinges creaked softly as she pushed the door inward. The inside smelled damp, dusty, and faintly rotten beneath the scent of seawater. Her flashlight beam swept across old machinery, shelves, rusted hooks, and peeling walls. Nothing moved. She exhaled slowly and stepped inside, telling herself the wind must have loosened the latch. Yet when she turned to close the door, she noticed something scratched into the inner metal surface. 4 deep lines, not random words. "Help us keep the light off." Mara stared at the message for several long seconds, unease creeping slowly beneath her ribs. The scratches looked old but not ancient. Certainly not from 1900. She raised her camera and snapped a photograph. The flash exploded across the narrow entrance hall for an instant, and in that brief white burst of light, she saw someone standing at the top of the spiral staircase above her. A tall figure, motionless, watching. The flash vanished. Darkness rushed back in. The staircase was empty. Mara's breath caught painfully in her throat. "Hello," she called upward, trying to sound annoyed instead of terrified. No answer came. Only the faint, distant sound of water somewhere deep beneath the lighthouse. She waited. Nothing. Finally, she climbed the spiral stairs cautiously, flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. The upper rooms were abandoned exactly as the records described. Rusted beds, water-stained logbooks, a broken kitchen table. But in the keeper's sleeping quarters, she found something impossible: a fresh ceramic mug sitting beside the window, steam still rising gently from the tea inside. Mara backed away slowly, pulse hammering in her ears. Then from somewhere below her in the lighthouse came the sound of the front door opening again. The sound echoed upward through the lighthouse like metal groaning underwater. Mara stood frozen beside the steaming mug, every muscle tightening at once. Someone had entered below her, or something. For several seconds she didn't move at all, listening to the silence that followed. No footsteps, no voice calling out, just the distant rhythmic crash of waves against cliffs far beneath the island. Slowly, she reached for the small can of pepper spray clipped to her backpack strap and crept toward the spiral staircase. Her flashlight beam trembled over the chipped stone walls as she descended. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. "This island is restricted." Still nothing. The staircase wound downward endlessly, tighter and darker than before. Halfway down, Mara noticed wet footprints on the steps below her. Bare human footprints, fresh seawater still glistening in them. Her chest tightened instantly. The prints climbed upward from the lower levels toward the rooms above. Toward her, she crouched slowly, shining the flashlight closer. The footprints were wrong somehow. The toes looked unnaturally long, stretched almost finger-like against the stone. Mara backed away immediately, pulse pounding in her neck. She nearly convinced herself it was erosion or distortion from the wet surface until she noticed something worse. There was only one set. Whatever made them had climbed the stairs on a single foot. The realization hit her like ice water. Step, drag, step, drag. She swallowed hard and continued downward despite every instinct screaming at her to lock herself in one of the rooms until sunrise. The entrance hall below was empty when she reached it. The lighthouse door stood shut exactly as she'd left it. No sign of anyone entering. Yet the air inside had changed. It smelled stronger now, thick with salt water and something faintly rotten beneath it, like seaweed left too long in the sun. Mara shined her flashlight toward the door and felt her stomach drop. The scratches on the metal surface had changed. "Help US keep the light off" was gone. In its place were fresh deep grooves gouged violently into the paint. "He knows you're here." Mara stumbled backward so quickly she almost fell. Her first instinct was denial. Stress, exhaustion, someone playing a prank. But deep inside she already knew none of those explanations fit what she was feeling. The lighthouse no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied and aware. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks against the front door. Heavy, deliberate, not frantic, not human. Mara stopped breathing entirely. Another 3 knocks followed several seconds later. She stared at the door while her mind desperately searched for logic. Callum returning, maybe. A joke. A fisherman. But something about the rhythm made her skin crawl. It sounded patient, as if whatever stood outside knew she would eventually answer. The knocking came again, this time accompanied by a wet, dragging sound against the metal. Mara forced herself closer to the entrance despite the terror knotting in her chest. There was no peephole, only a narrow side window clouded by salt and age. Slowly, she angled herself toward it and peered outside. At first, she saw nothing except darkness and the faint outline of rain-slick rocks. Then her flashlight beam reflected faintly off something near the steps below. A face, standing completely motionless in the dark beneath the lighthouse. Her breath caught sharply. It looked like a man wearing old weatherproof gear, soaked black with seawater. His skin appeared pale grey beneath the hood, almost swollen, and one side of his face sagged strangely like melting wax. But the worst part was the eyes. They reflected no light whatsoever. Just flat, endless black. The figure tilted its head slowly upward toward the window as if sensing her gaze. Then it smiled. Mara stumbled backward with a gasp. The knocking immediately stopped. Silence swallowed the lighthouse again. She stood there trembling violently, every nerve in her body screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The island itself suddenly felt impossibly small. A prison made of rock and ocean. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped her flashlight while grabbing her satellite phone from her bag. No signal, of course. She cursed under her breath and paced the entrance hall, trying to think rationally. Maybe someone else had secretly reached the island. Maybe a squatter. A mentally ill drifter. But even as she formed the explanations, another part of her mind kept replaying the things she'd noticed most clearly through the window. The figure's clothes, old lighthouse keeper gear, early 20th century. Exactly like the uniforms from the photographs she had studied before the trip. A loud metallic clang suddenly exploded from somewhere beneath her feet. Mara jumped violently. Another clang followed, echoing through the stone floor below the entrance hall. The maintenance tunnels, she remembered reading about them in archived restoration documents. Narrow passageways carved beneath the lighthouse foundations to access storage and storm drainage systems. Her flashlight beam swept toward a rusted hatch tucked beneath the staircase. It now stood slightly open. Black seawater glistened around its edges. Mara approached slowly, heart hammering so hard it hurt. From the darkness below came the faint sound of someone breathing. Wet. Uneven. Followed by a whisper drifting upward through the hatch in a cracked, trembling voice. "Don't let him relight it." Then silence. Mara knelt beside the hatch, every instinct telling her not to open it further. But before she could decide, the lighthouse beacon above her suddenly roared to life. The massive light exploded through the tower with a deafening mechanical groan, beams of white slicing violently across the island and sea. Mara stared upward in horror. The lighthouse had no power. It hadn't functioned in years. Yet overhead the ancient machinery turned slowly awake, like something resurrected. And from outside, beyond the walls, she heard dozens of wet footsteps beginning to climb the stone path toward the door. The footsteps outside multiplied rapidly, wet soles slapping against stone from every direction around the lighthouse. Mara backed away from the entrance hall, flashlight trembling violently in her grip while the ancient beacon above rotated with a thunderous metallic groan. White light swept through the windows every few seconds, briefly illuminating the interior in flashes like lightning underwater. Each pass of the beam brought shadows crawling across the walls in jerking, unnatural shapes. The knocking returned, no longer patient. Fists or hands or something heavier slammed against the front door in uneven bursts. Then came voices, low at first, barely audible beneath the grinding beacon machinery, men whispering over one another outside in the dark. "Open the door, please. It's cold." Mara felt her blood turn to ice because she recognized the accents from archived interviews she had listened to before coming here. The missing keepers, Scottish Island dialects preserved in century-old recordings. Her mind rejected the idea instantly, yet the certainty remained. Another voice joined them. "Mara." She froze completely. Her flashlight almost slipped from her hand. The voice sounded exactly like her father. Calm, gentle, dead for 7 years. "Sweetheart," the voice called softly through the door. "Open up." Tears stung her eyes immediately from pure instinctive shock. The thing outside spoke again in her father's voice, but wrong somehow, the rhythm slightly delayed, like someone imitating human speech after only hearing it secondhand. "You left me alone," it whispered. Mara backed toward the staircase in horror. The pounding on the door intensified instantly as if reacting to her fear. Metal groaned violently. The hinges began bending inward. Then, from beneath her feet, the hatch below the stairs burst fully open with a scream of rusted iron. Black seawater spilled across the floor. Something climbed out. Mara swung her flashlight downward and nearly vomited. A man dragged himself slowly from the darkness below, wearing the decayed remains of lighthouse keeper clothing soaked black with seawater. His skin hung pale and bloated from his body in strips. One leg bent backward unnaturally beneath him as he crawled, yet his eyes were alive, wide with terror. "Turn it off," he gasped desperately, before he seized the shore. Mara stumbled backward up the staircase while the man clawed weakly after her. "Who?" she screamed. The keeper's face twisted in panic. The thing beneath the water. The lighthouse suddenly shook violently. Not from wind, from impact. Something enormous had struck the cliffs below. Dust rained from the ceiling. Outside, all the whispering voices stopped at once. Complete silence swallowed the island. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Then the beacon swept across the sea again, and Mara saw it. Through the upper lighthouse windows, far beyond the cliffs in the black Atlantic water, something massive moved beneath the surface. At first, her brain couldn't process the scale. It looked almost like an island itself slowly turning beneath the waves. Then she saw pale shapes unfolding upward from the darkness. Fingers, hundreds of them. Vast human-like hands rising silently from the ocean around a body too enormous to fully comprehend beneath the water. The lighthouse beam illuminated only fragments of it each rotation. Slick, grey flesh, clusters of lidless eyes opening beneath the sea, an immense curved skull stretching upward toward the surface. Mara felt something ancient and primal break loose inside her mind. Not fear exactly, recognition. Like her brain suddenly understood why humans feared deep water before language even existed. The crawling keeper grabbed her ankle violently. "It follows the light," he rasped. "That's why we kept it dark." His fingers dug painfully into her skin. "It waits beneath the islands. It hears the beacon." Another impact shook the lighthouse harder than before. Stone cracked somewhere below. Mara heard water flooding the lower tunnels. The keeper looked upward in pure horror. "It's waking." Then the front door downstairs exploded inward. Mara heard dozens of wet bodies entering the lighthouse below. Slow, dragging footsteps immediately filled the spiral staircase beneath her. She ran upward toward the beacon chamber as the dead keeper crawled after her, screaming for her to extinguish the light. The staircase seemed endless now, twisting tighter and steeper while the sounds below multiplied. Dozens of voices murmuring together, wet hands scraping stone. She reached the beacon room and slammed the iron door behind her just as pale fingers stretched through the stair rails below. The top chamber spun with blinding white light from the rotating lens. Ancient gears thundered around her despite having no power source, and standing beside the beacon was Callum. The boat captain stared at her calmly while seawater dripped from his clothes onto the floor. His expression looked exhausted rather than hostile. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. Mara backed away in disbelief. "You knew?" Callum nodded slowly. "My grandfather was one of the last caretakers here after the disappearances. They figured out the truth eventually." Another colossal impact shuddered through the tower. Far below, something huge scraped against the cliffs like a ship grinding over rock. Callum looked toward the sea through the rotating light. Every few years someone tries restoring the beacon. Every few years more people vanish. Mara stared at him. "What is that thing?" The old man's eyes reflected the sweeping white beam. "Nobody knows," he paused, "but it learns people, learns voices, memories. The keepers in 1900 tried shutting the light off after they saw it climbing from the water." He swallowed hard. It got inside before they could. The wet footsteps reached the staircase outside the beacon room. Slow, dragging, dozens of them. Callum stepped toward the machinery. "Once the light sees the mainland," he whispered, "it follows it." Mara realized what he intended an instant too late. Callum seized the massive rotating mechanism and forced his body into the grinding gears. Bones snapped instantly with a horrible wet crunch. Blood sprayed across the lens. The machinery screamed violently and jammed. The lighthouse beacon flickered once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the island completely. Silence followed, absolute and suffocating. The footsteps outside stopped immediately. Far below, the massive thing in the ocean released a sound that barely resembled a human voice. Not loud, worse than loud. Deep enough to vibrate through the stone tower and into Mara's ribs. A disappointed sound. Then slowly, over several minutes, the ocean retreated. Mara remained trapped in the dark beacon room until sunrise, listening to the water draining from the tunnels below and the occasional distant scrape of something enormous moving away beneath the sea. When rescue crews finally arrived that morning, they found her alone beside the ruined machinery covered in dried blood. Official reports blamed mechanical collapse and psychological distress. The story became another strange footnote added to the Flannan Isles legend. But months later, after Mara returned home to London, she began waking every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of distant foghorns outside her apartment, despite living miles from the sea. At first she thought it was trauma, until the morning she noticed seawater pooled beneath her bedroom window and handprints. Large wet handprints climbing slowly up the outside of the glass from 13 stories below.